Okay. As I said, welcome, Adam. Adam is a former WordPress contributor and also a developer relation person at Google. So today he's going to be talking about Web Vitals and WordPress. And Adam, the floor is yours. Get started.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm here twice because I opened up another window so I can see all your faces. I'm on the web Zoom client, so I don't get the grid, but I can share my screen. So I'm going to start with that. Let's see. Share screen. All right. Give me a second to arrange this here. And here we go. Ah! All right. Are you guys seeing my screen now? Does that work?
Yep, this works good. Like we are able to see it, and it's like covering the entire screen as well.
Yeah, and do feel free. I'm going to give this presentation. I don't know how long I'm going to take. I'll try to take about a half an hour. Like Sudhar said, leave your questions in the chat. If I might at a couple points even pause and ask for questions. I really am open to feedback about this talk. This is a talk that I'm kind of developing. My team, we talk a lot about Web Vitals, but I'm trying to specifically talk about Web Vitals in the WordPress context. And just to give you a little bit more background on myself, I am currently at Google focused on web developer relations in the CMS ecosystem. Before that, I was at 10up, so that's how I know Sudhar. I was there for over 6 years, and I'm very active in the WordPress core community. I'm a core committer, and I try to spend a good bit of my time continuing to work on WordPress core as well as Gutenberg. But today I'm here to talk to you about Web Vitals. You've probably heard about Web Vitals. If you haven't, this is kind of a new initiative from Google. It's been kind of a long time coming. The idea of Web Vitals is to focus on metrics that measure user experience. Measuring metrics about how websites are performing is something that we've been doing for a long time, and there's a lot of different metrics out there. But the idea is to hone in on these core metrics that kind of represent a vital web experience, a great experience for users. All the links that I have here, you'll see that these links that I have all over, I will give them all to you at the end, so don't worry about copying them down. Also a link to this slide deck at the end. So don't worry about catching all those. But I do have links here. There's a lot of great articles, especially on web.dev, which is a site that hopefully you guys have all seen. It's maintained by my team at Google, and it's a really great resource for web development best practices. So there's basically 3 pillars of Web Vitals that we're going to be looking at: loading, interactivity, and visual stability. These are things you've all probably thought about before, but really the aim of Web Vitals is to get at a way to measure these programmatically and consistently, and we're going to dig into each of them. So, is my site loading? Can I interact with my site? When I try to interact, is it responsive? And visual stability is about all the jumpiness that we sometimes see in layouts where stuff is popping in and we're trying to read something or click on something and the page jumps around. So those 3 areas, loading, interactivity, and visual stability, are represented by these 3 new metrics. Well, actually, first input delay is not new, but these other 2 are actually pretty new metrics. Largest content paint and cumulative layout shift. We're going to go into each of these, but this overview slide just kind of shows you that for each metric, there is a specific cutoff for what's considered good, what's considered needs improvement, and what's considered poor. And the goal is to deliver a good experience to 75% of your visitors. That's sort of should be your goal in terms of, you're not going to be able to give an excellent experience to every visitor for various reasons, but you want to hit that 75th percentile mark. I'm going to go into each of these metrics in more detail, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about how these metrics are collected. So these metrics, for the most part, are real user metrics, measurements, and that is information that comes from the Crux database. This is the Chrome User Experience Database, and this is data that's collected from Chrome users who opt in. So it represents actual real user interaction with your website. This is different than lab metrics, which you can also measure lab metrics for these variables, but what you're going to get is a different number. So when you take your own website and you measure it locally, or even when you're testing it in isolation against your web server at whatever time of day or from whatever location that you test it from, you're going to get one result. But when you take a set of users out on the web, in the wild, you're going to get a more sort of real result of what people are actually seeing when they actually visit your website. Just for example, things like ads often don't load in a staging or local environment, so that's going to make a huge difference. A lot of different scripts have different behaviors depending on where you are, or where, like what the domain is. So you can get all kinds of different results when you're testing things with the testing tools we're going to go into in a minute. But it's important to understand that when you're using tools like PageSpeed Insights, you're actually getting data from real world users. And this is sort of like the slide that's kind of why you might want to care about Core Web Vitals. And I think we all sort of intuitively know this, that when our websites perform better, when they're more responsive, when they load quickly for people, they are more likely to be engaged with those sites. They're less likely to leave. This is just some actual data that backs that intuition up. And you can read more about it, about all the science behind these Web Vitals with the link, and I'll have all those links for you at the end, like I said. The other real reason that you should care about this, other than caring about your users, which is very important, is that Google has announced that Core Web Vitals will become part of the page experience ranking. So page experience ranking is one of the metrics that's used to signal your placement in search results. So all things being equal, a site with better page experience is going to have a higher result than one that doesn't have that. And Google has announced that they will start introducing, looking at Core Web Vitals sometime next year. It's not currently launched in search. Another important thing to understand about Core Web Vitals is that it's not something where this is how it's going to be forever. We plan to revisit metrics each year and announce new metrics around the time of Google I/O each year, which typically happens in the summer. So you will see these getting refined as we test them in the wild and we get feedback from developers and users alike. So this is something that we hope to really keep honing in on what makes a great experience and how can we measure that. Obviously, there's other things that go into signals for page experience, like is it mobile friendly? Does it have HTTPS? Those kinds of things that we already know about, but these are pretty new, having these Core Web Vitals come into search ranking. So let's jump in here to the specific vitals. I'm starting with the last one because this one I think is just really easy to understand. This is the cumulative sum of all unexpected layout shifts that occur during the lifespan of a page. So this is something that actually it happens over time, and it's measured like as the user is interacting with the site. So layout shifts occur when new content pops into the display, when the browser doesn't know the size of content before it's loaded. Those are the types of things we're talking about. And I love this little slide here. I'm just going to let it run for a second. The user's, trying not to submit their order, but right before they click the button, no, go back, something pops in at the top, and they click, and they actually click submit their order, and they're very frustrated. So this is, probably a little bit contrived, but this is the kind of thing we're really trying to avoid with shifting content. So just a little bit to talk about this in WordPress, and this, a lot of this does apply to any site, but I'm going to sort of focus in on the WordPress specific stuff. One thing that's really important is ensuring that all your images have width and height. We do have a somewhat kind of bad situation that with images, I would say, that came in with Gutenberg, in that image output since 5.0 does typically, I think, not include width and height on content placed images, as well as images like a featured image that you call out programmatically. That is being fixed in 5.5. So I linked the core ticket there so you can better understand that. The importance of having width and height for imagery is that it lets the browser kind of know the shape of the content before the image loads. So without those width and height for images, what you have is you have little collapsed areas, and then as soon as the image loads, they expand, and that causes the layout shift. So this is something that we really need to avoid. It is something that has evolved in the web over time. There was a period of time where people were using CSS and not putting image sizes in to allow images to be more fluid. That approach turned out to not be great, and one of the reasons is because it causes this layout shift. Any kind of dynamic content that you have on your site, this might be a discus form, it might be something that pops into the sidebar. Ads is a really good example of the type of content I'm talking about. Anything that's built in JavaScript that's going to render dynamically. The ideal situation is you sort of reserve that space for that you know is going to pop in your layout, in your CSS, so that it doesn't create a shift. Spend some time optimizing your featured image. So, I mean, this actually applies to like all the things, but all the metrics, I should say. And this isn't really specific to CLS. I think I thought of this with CLS because a lot of times that we see images come in and pop in and shift the content, especially that top image if it doesn't have size and it's slow to load because it's such a large image. I watched a really great deep dive that was from the Web Dev Live Summit. It just came out recently. I put a YouTube link in there if you like watching videos. My colleagues go into image compression, which has evolved quite a bit since I learned about it maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So Squish is a tool that the team released. It's just a web-based tool that lets you really explore image compression. But I would say for your featured images, especially for those hero images, really spend some time trying to optimize those to get the best experience for users. That maybe even applies more to this next one. So largest contentful paint is a way to measure kind of when the page is fully loaded. And I think one of the things that it's important here is it's a little bit different than how we thought about page loading before. There have been kind of different metrics that we've tried to use to measure, like when is the page fully loaded. You know, it's not on DOM ready isn't really not a good one. We had first contentful paint, which is shown here, is very early on. It can happen very early on in the process, but really when the largest item, which is going to typically be that hero image or some other large element in the viewport, when that renders is when the page can be considered to be mostly there. So the way this works is as content comes in, the size of that content is measured when the largest item is finally registered. That's when your largest contentful paint has happened. And you want to have that happen within 2.5 seconds to be considered in that good range. So here's just like a little illustration of what I mean by that. So you can see the content is coming in all the way, you know, all the way here. It's still loading, it's loading, but it's not till this large image comes in that LCP is considered fulfilled. So in WordPress, 5.5 recently introduced lazy loading to all images, or will introduce lazy loading to all images, which is great for a whole slew of reasons. But one thing that we discovered in testing this feature is that browsers currently are not very good about handling images that are in the viewport and are marked as lazy load. You would think that if something was already in the viewport and you put lazy load after going on the browser, would just ignore that and would load the image as quickly as possible. But that is actually not the case currently. The browsers are not that great about that. We did consider in core not adding the lazy tag there, but we really don't know when those images, we're not sure which images are up there, and also we're hoping browsers will fix this. But this is something to consider if you're building a custom theme, and you might want to exclude that featured image, that hero image, from having the loading equals lazy tag that will be introduced in 5.5. I think the biggest thing here is just really trying to simplify your pages and make sure that the load, the rendering of the page can happen very quickly, that you reduce the complexity of the page and the number of styles and scripts that have to be loaded by the browser before it can start rendering. Concatenating scripts and styles, that's something that happens automatically on some hosts. On other hosts, you'll need to make sure you do that, yourself or with some kind of a plugin, because you don't want to have many scripts loading if you can group them into one group, just like and make a faster load. Everything below the viewport should be lazy loaded, so that obviously includes images, which will happen automatically now in 5.5, but it also includes things like ads, making sure that you're not requesting the rendering of ads until they're coming into the viewport. Making sure your host is fast. This is also going to apply to first input delay, but this does affect LCP because it just how quickly can the content get to the browser. Using the latest version of PHP is going to also ensure that that like initial rendering time is fast. And then consider AMP as a possible technology to build your site in. And AMP actually addresses all of these metrics, and I am going to talk a little bit about AMP later on, so I won't go into that too much right now. First input delay. I'm just looking to see what time it is. Okay, great. So first input delay is trying to measure when the page becomes interactive. In the past, again, we've tried different metrics. Time to interactive is one you might have heard of before. First contentful paint, is one that we measured, kind of like when did this page start painting. What this tries to measure is how long does it take between when the user starts interacting with the page and the page responds. And it's important to understand that this is, a metric that you need to measure with users, right? So it's a user metric, and the way we get it is by measuring real user interactions in the wild, using the Crux database, using the people who've opted in on the Chrome browser to send metrics back. And that data is, by the way, publicly available and queryable, and we'll get into that as well. But this is kind of a nuanced approach, but the idea here, again, is to measure when does the page actually start responding, and what's going to affect that is not, it's mostly going to be affected by other JavaScript that's running in the page that's blocking the main thread. So you've all experienced sort of jankiness when you try to do something with a website and it just doesn't work well. That's because the website is busy doing something. It's running some JavaScript code, and it's trying very hard to accomplish something, and it's ignoring it can't take care of both that and your own input. So the idea is here, like, when does the page settle down to the point where the browser can actually respond to interaction? And so all previous advice applies about getting everything there fast. A couple other things is making sure the async tag is applied to enqueued strips when possible. So async is a way of telling the browser, hey, I've got this JavaScript I want you to load, but just load it when you can. You don't need to load it right away. Without that tag, JavaScript tends to load and sort of block. In other words, the browser really can't continue processing things like user interaction until the JavaScript has loaded and kind of completed its execution. Async is not supported directly by WP and QScript, but you can very easily add it. And I linked to a track where we were discussing adding it as a core feature, and it explains basically how you can add it with current filters. I linked another YouTube video. This is just a real deep dive into optimizing Web Vitals. It's kind of a case study. It's not a WordPress site, but it does really give you good insight into how you can spend, really dig into what is causing issues with Web Vitals and how you can improve them. So this is something that is not, it's going to be an ongoing thing. It's going to be, every site has different needs. So something you'll need to learn more about to be effective at. And this video is just like a real great deep dive into it. So that's kind of it for the metrics. Hopefully everything's clear there. I guess I will leave questions to the end. I think that's probably going to be the easiest. But that is basically the overview of the metrics. So the next thing that I want to sort of talk about is, like, how do we monitor these things? What do we do with these metrics? And where are we going from here? How can we deal with this? So Google has a ton of tools that all now support core Web Vitals. You're probably familiar with some of these, most of these. Lighthouse is a spectacular tool. It has both, I'm going to go into each of these tools, but you've probably seen these Lighthouse, PageSpeed Insights. The DevTools panel has Lighthouse built into it. The Crux user database that I mentioned before, which is now like very easy to query and build dashboards on top of. Google Search Console, previously Webmaster Toolkit, that you can kind of see how you appear in Google Search. That also gives you information about your vitals. And then we also have a Chrome web extension that you can install, and that one's super fun because it'll give you the vitals about every site that you visit. And there's even one more, which is there's a JavaScript library that you can add. I do want to give a plug out to a product that I have worked on for the last several years, including at my time at 10up and now working at Google. I'm still working on this project. This is SiteKit. by Google. This is our canonical plugin to bring all of Google's services into your WordPress dashboard. We recently added Core Web Vitals to this. So you will now be getting display of those vitals that are, if they're available for your site. In other words, if there is crux data. And pretty soon we're going to let you start measuring them even if there isn't. So I'll talk about that in a minute. It is important to understand with the user data and the lab data. So if you go to PageSpeed Insights and you run a report on your website, if your website is a highly trafficked website with large user base, it's likely to have that crux data. But if it's a small personal blog or a small business, it may not be in that data base because it only captures like 6 million sites or something. So what instead you'll have to do is run the lighthouse, the kind of lab test of your sites. This is where the service goes out and tries to hit your site and maybe uses some throttling, but tries to come up with a guess about how your site is performing. It's not really quite the same as real user metrics. And I am going to talk a little bit about how you can gather real user metrics even if your site isn't in the crux database. So this is what that looks like in SiteKit. So you can see, those metrics coming right into your SiteKit. You'll see them every time you log in. It's really easy to grab, kind of notice things that are changing. You've got both mobile and desktop views. And over time, we're going to kind of improve this and try to bring in some of the recommendations and things like that. I do want to talk about the AMP plugin for WordPress because I think this is a spectacular tool for helping you build sites that meet all of these vitals, all of these metrics. That is to say that not every site that's built with AMP does meet Core Web Vitals. It is something like 70–80% that do, though. And when AMP was first announced, it was a way to improve your site, but it was also a way to get into the news carousel on Google search. That is going to be opened up, so any sites that meet the Core Web Vitals will now qualify for that carousel, and AMP will have to compete on the same playing field as everyone else in terms of if AMP sites don't meet that requirement, they will not appear in that carousel. So we want sites that appear in that carousel to have that excellent experience. I want to talk about just a few other benefits of AMP, and I know when I first started developing with AMP, I was very resistant to it, and in part because it represented a huge amount of additional work for the sites that I was working on. So these large enterprise sites that had developed a lot of custom features for their website, all kinds of interactive elements on the page, and custom graphics, and all kinds of nifty things that we would build for them. And then suddenly AMP came along and we had to rebuild all those features again in AMP. So as a developer, that was a frustrating experience. More recently, a couple things have come out. First is I'm working on a lot of sites that in the Newspack ecosystem, which are AMP first. So these are sites that are built entirely in AMP and do not have a non-AMP component. So there's no developing two separate things. There's one thing. It's the AMP site. The other thing is this plugin, which is actively supported by developers at Google and has a pretty large, actually, contributor base of people. This plugin, the official AMP plugin for WordPress, takes your WordPress site and churns it into an AMP site with almost no effort on your part. The amount of work that it does at this point is astonishing, including server-side rendering of AMP, which means that your origin page views are going to be almost as fast as your cache page views. So one thing to understand with AMP is that because of the guarantees that it offers for performance, Google caches and also Bing caches AMP pages on their own cache and basically can deliver them to end clients almost instantly. That does create some issues because of the fact that it's served on not your origin domain. Typically on a second click, people will arrive at the origin domain. But the AMP plugin for WordPress actually makes it trivial to launch a site in AMP and has continued to develop more and more support with all the core themes and other themes supporting it so that you can really build quite sophisticated sites now. Take a look at the Newspack project is a really good example. It's an open source project that I'm working on with Automatic. And and build sites that are built in AMP that are going to, AMP is designed to kind of meet these performance guarantees. So it's going to get you a long ways with a small amount of effort. And not to say that this is the only framework that's out there. This is just one approach. There's a lot of other things that people are looking at to try to deliver fast websites in WordPress. We do have a little bit of a reputation in WordPress for being slow, and there's been a lot of caching plugins and CDNs and things that try to address various pieces of that. This is something that we still need to work on. Newspack, I did mention Newspack. This is something that I've been working on quite closely. It is an open source project from Automatic and sponsored in part by the Google News Initiative. This is a collection of plugins. It's a single orchestrator plugin that will install all of these other plugins for you. It includes things like Sitekit and Jetpack and ads.txt and all kinds of plugins that help build out a complete newsroom site. And I'll have a link to it in the final thing. But if you check out these sites, especially the ones that have launched with full AMP, which most of them aim to be, they're blazingly fast. They look gorgeous. This project includes a couple of themes as well as a suite of blocks that people can use, as well as a bunch of features like email newsletters and campaign engagement type tools. So really interesting stuff. And a great example of how all these things can come together inside WordPress and still deliver sites that are super fast and meet all the core web vitals. So let's talk about some of the tools that are available for monitoring these vitals. Chrome DevTools is probably the tool that I use the most in my day-to-day work, constantly in DevTools, debugging things in console typically. The performance tab, I spend a little less time in there, but if you go in there, you'll notice there's a new experience line, and that line will have lists of layout shift. You can also see the timings tab here. I think I've got another one about that. But you're basically going to have the the Core Web Vitals information built right into DevTools now. And also super powerful stuff like you can click on largest contentful paint, and it's going to highlight the element on the page that actually caused that LCP, that triggered that LCP. That was the largest item that rendered. So you can actually see right in your timeline what which each of these metrics is applying to. PageSpeed Insights is a web-based tool. It also has a fantastic API that you can use. It will scan your site if there's lab data. If there's real-world user data, it will provide that. Otherwise, and in addition, it's going to provide you with lab data. So that's the field data here and lab data that you see. Those are those two different things. Field data is again, the more valuable one, the more accurate one. That's what's going to show first. If it's not available, you just won't see it. A couple other things to point out here. It provides an origin summary. So typically when we're looking at a site like example.com here, when you're trying to gauge metrics, when you tell a tool to check a page, it's going to check that page. So checking the home page, which may not be the whole story about a site, right? A single page may be different, an archive page may be different, a page may be different in terms of performance characteristics. So what origin does, this show origin summary, is it gives you the report for your whole site. So this is how is the performance for the whole site doing. And you can also get that by typing origin : and then your domain name when you launch PageSpeed Insights. One other really cool thing in PageSpeed Insights are the stack packs. These are kind of platform-specific recommendations that tell you how you can actually make meaningful improvements in your site. So don't neglect to click through all the little expansions that are available there. So like in this case, there's an example, there's a recommendation specifically for WordPress and also specifically for React, which was detected on the page. So the idea here is that we want to provide developers with real actionable direction that they can provide. I will also mention that these stack packs are open source. So if you want to contribute back to that, if you have something that you think could be improved and can describe that in a succinct way for the web to see, request welcome. Lighthouse is the tool kind of underlying some of these other tools. This is the one that's doing the lab metrics. You can see a Lighthouse tab in your dev tools. I think that think that's built in now. This is going to provide very similar metrics. Some of them are, slightly different. It does have some really nice features, like it has a node script that you can run. There's a browser extension for it. There's also a continuous integration for Lighthouse, so you can have Lighthouse run, for example, every time you do a commit or a pull request is opened. I really like the Chrome extension, although it's a little distracting because the LCP keeps changing. The CLS keeps changing over time because things keep shifting as you scroll down the page or whatever. So you'll see it keep changing, but it is a really great way to quickly see these values for sites that you're visiting. And then we also have a JavaScript library that's available on GitHub that you can add to your site, and I'm going to show you how to do that. And what that will do is it will measure real user vitals for visitors to your site. So you install this little tiny bit of JavaScript onto your website, and it will send data about user visit timing back to analytics. So this is what that looks like. This is just, I just actually installed it on my personal site a few days ago. It's just a couple days of data. And you can see that I've got CLS, LCP, and FID coming right into analytics. I do have a link at the end to a gist that will give you the exact code that you need to put on your site. I'm sure someone can create a plugin for this too. This is the exact same code that we're going to use inside SiteKit when we launch that feature. So it'll be just something you can enable in SiteKit, or maybe it'll be enabled by default. But in any case, it will give you the ability to capture real user metrics from your site visitors and send those off to your analytics provider, whether that be Google Analytics or any analytics provider, so that you can actually measure real user interactions with your site. The Chrome UX report is great if you have a site that has data in the Crux database. So again, the Crux database is the Chrome user experience database. It's always been open, but this is a new thing that they've released, which is a really quick way to build a dashboard in Data Studio that will pull in information about your site or a set of sites, and you can measure it over time and things like that. I've linked to some articles so you can dig into this a little more. Search Console, which I'm sure you probably are all familiar with. This is where you go to kind of get your site verified and see how you're doing in Google search. Also now includes Web Vitals from Crux field data. I don't think it includes lab data, so you'll need to actually have your site. This won't apply to smaller sites. This is a dashboard that I built in Data Studio for the Newspack sites, and it is a monitoring script that runs on a nightly cron job inside a Google Sheet. So Google Sheets, if you haven't explored this, have a whole app script language, and inside Google Sheets you can access APIs, including the PageSpeed Insights API, and using that you can record the data for a set of sites into a spreadsheet, and then later you can build a dashboard like this in Data Studio. If you haven't used Data Studio, it's super fun. It lets you pull in data from all kinds of sources and build cool graphs and tables with it, with filters and dates and things like that. So this is something that I built for the Newspack site so that we can kind of keep track of which ones are performing well, which ones are running fully in AMP, how their page speed scores are doing. I have a link to a gist at the end here that will give you the app script code that runs this in the spreadsheet. I can't really give you this dashboard, but I can encourage you to just go try to build things with Data Studio. It's actually not that hard. I'm a total novice at it, and this is my second go at building a performance monitor sheet for them, and yeah, it looks great because the tool is good. So that's it for my discussion. So these are the links. I'm going to leave this screen up here just for a couple minutes so you can copy them down. The first one is the link to the talk, and the second one is a link to hopefully a document that just has all the links in the document, plus some other links, things like the gists and so forth. So those are just bit.ly short-coded, web-vitals-wp, web-vitals-links. Hopefully you guys all got that. I can type those in the chat. I'm going to stop presenting so I can see people. All right, I can't actually see many people. I guess whoever's talking I can see.
So thanks, Adam. I think like it was a very like feature-packed talk. Like there's like I've already noted down a lot of to-dos from this talk, like that I have to go and check. So I'm pretty sure like it was very helpful to a lot of people. I personally have a
Yeah.
lot of questions, but I'm just gonna wait for people to like leave their questions in chat. Like once like we are done with the other questions, I'll probably ask my questions to you first.
Okay.
Yeah. So, like, while the questions keep coming, like you mentioned about the Crux database, right?
Yeah.
So does that also keep track of the device on which the browser is running? Like, in addition to
Yes.
whether it's the mobile or okay. So,
I think
and
so. I don't have that much experience pulling data from Crux, but I know for sure like there's even an attempt to make to know which platform it's on. So there's like some platform sniffing that happens there,
Mhm.
because I know in some of the Crux like dashboards that we have, we can filter down to see like how are WordPress sites doing, how does how do their metrics look versus Drupal sites? We can actually compare those in the Crux database because it does have those. And I assume mobile and devices are also in there, although I'm not 100% sure about that.
Mhm. Okay, awesome. So the first question that we have is like the person is asking whether AMP is like very necessary, like it is,
Yeah.
and like it changes the look and feel, right? So like the amount of effort that we have put in getting a unique look and feel, like once we use AMP, that's going to be kind of changed a bit, right? So what are your thoughts on
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some truth to that. So first of all, AMP is not necessary. AMP is one tool out of many. I would love to personally learn about what other tools people are using to get great performance out of WordPress. I know people are really interested in things like Gatsby static site generators, static, the service. Those types of things to me indicate that those might be a good direction to go. I do know that sites that I've built that had a lot of JavaScript, we sacrificed some of that initial page load for better performance through the life of the user's journey. And that's something that we realize at Google, like just measuring how quickly a page loads doesn't tell the whole story. So that's something that, over time we might improve. If you have a single page app, for example, it might take longer to load initially, but then the experience is really great interacting with it. I would push back a little bit about the all AMP sites look the same. I encourage you to go look at the Newspack project and the Newspack theme. I think AMP was originally thought of as a mobile first, and people kind of did these very stacked layouts. And it's true that if you enable the AMP plugin, that your typical like basic WordPress theme is going to give you a very typical AMP thing. But if you look at for example, the Newspack plugin and install it, or the Newspack themes and blocks, which are available on GitHub, on the automatic GitHub repo, you will find that you can build very complex, sophisticated layouts that don't look anything like what you might think a typical AMP site looks like. So it is a little bit about the tooling, like what themes and blocks you're using at this point to build your site. So AMP is not the only way. That's the short answer. And also, AMP doesn't have to look horrible. AMP is limiting, right? So we all know it's limiting. They did up the CSS limit from 50K to 75K. That was a huge win for designers. But part of like why it's limiting, part of why we have those guardrails is to try to enforce that excellent user experience. That's kind of always been the philosophy, and that's there's always kind of this tension or balance between say the people who want to put more and more ads on your website and the web developer who wants to increase the performance of the site. And you can't just say, well, we don't want to have any ads on the site because we want the best performance. Well, that doesn't really work because then you don't make any money because all your money comes from the ads. So you have to find a balance where the ads aren't destroying the experience. That is to say that everything's a little bit of a trade-off. So when you're going with AMP, you're restricting what you can do, you're limiting what you can do, but on the other hand, you're going to get this great experience. So there is value there.
Okay, so yeah, the next question is like from Meenakshi. Like, so basically, he has a question about like in his site, there is a difference between how the scores for the mobile and the desktop site. So the desktop has a very good score, but the mobile has a slightly low score. And this is also something that I have seen in a couple of other sites as well. This is a trend that I've seen. So do you have any insight about like why this could happen?
Yeah, I don't know offhand. I think you have to dig into the numbers to really see that. I think you have to compare. If you do the reports in PageSpeed Insights, you'll get a lot of details that you can click through and actually expand and see what the exact reasons you're getting that lower score are. Yeah, I can't think of anything like just offhand that just like, oh yeah, mobile sites are always going to be slower or something. No, I mean, I think you need to really look at what's loading on the page. I don't really have a direct answer to that. In terms of how long, when you make an enhancement, how long does it take to appear in Crux? I also don't know the answer to that. My sense is that it's probably like a month, because I think they release data on a monthly basis into the database. The real world testing, you can do the lab testing, right? So you can actually see differences immediately with lab testing. Even though it's not the same as user testing, it does give you a sense of whether you've improved something or made it worse.
Okay, cool. So yeah, the next question is about like, your thoughts on PWA on Web Vitals, right? So the progressive
Yep.
web and like, how that stacks up when we include Web Vitals as part of it.
Yeah. So I don't know if it directly affects Web Vitals. In WordPress, we have a really great PWA plugin that's available. It's also used by Newspack. So like the Newspack sites are all they're all available offline. You can install them on your homepage. So those are like typical PWA type characteristics. My guess is that if anything, they might penalize the site. You've probably got more JavaScript loading than you otherwise would. There might be there is an effort to kind of offload some stuff into the worker, so it's not happening in the main thread. That could improve first input delay. I don't really have enough experience to know which of those is true. It may be a trade-off thing where you're going to get something better in one place and something worse in another place.
Okay, yeah, like in life, everything is a trade-off, right? So you need to balance things out.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, so another question is from Vijayan. He kind of asked about, like, when we are using this Web Vital, the concept of Web Vital, right? How does it affect the the CSS object model? And he's also trying to compare that with DOM. So we have the DOM and then the CSS object model, and then he's looking for, advice on like which one to follow, like, and possibly like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't actually know that much about the CSS object model. I'm assuming this is something that browsers are doing internally to kind of manage CSS. I mean, obviously, I don't really know the answer to that, but I know that the way these things are measured in the real world is it's by looking at, there's actually like APIs in the browser that tell, that like the timing APIs that will tell you sort of when something has rendered. And obviously, when something is rendered and how quickly it can render does have a lot to do with your CSS. So that's important in terms of simplifying that. But in terms of like what's the most effective thing to focus on, simplifying your DOM or simplifying your CSS, I don't really have a direct answer. That's something you have to experiment with and learn. I hope I answered that question a little bit. I don't actually know much about CSSOM, so I'm going to go study it after this talk.
Yeah, I think like even this is the first time I'm hearing about it as well. So I was like curious about like what is that, and maybe need to look up at that. Okay, so another question I have personally is like, so out of the three metrics, right, the CLS metric, the cumulative layout shift, right? So that one is actually like, so the other ones are absolute numbers. So one is in milliseconds and the other one is in seconds, right? The LCP is in seconds and the other one is in milliseconds. But this, I think, is in fractions, right? So can you give more insight about how that fractions, or like how to understand the fraction? Is it like the lower is good or higher is good, or?
Yeah, so it's like 0 to 1. I'd have to go back to the slide, but there it is explained. There is an article that's linked in my, it's like Web Vitals methodology, I think is what the link is, or Web Vital Science. There's two articles that were posted to the blog that explain how those numbers are calculated, and that one in particular is very confusing to people because I think it goes between 0 and 1. And yeah, it's a fraction, like you're saying. And I don't really, if I tried to explain it to you right now, I would mess it up. So I would just encourage you, if you really want to dig in, to go read these articles about the methodology. I can say that there was a huge amount of research and work put into how we decide to measure these things, which things we measure, which numbers are good, which numbers are okay, which numbers are bad. And I would just encourage you to go read about that if you really want to know more, or watch. There's a one, if you're a YouTube kind of person, there is a talk by Addy who just goes into great detail. I don't know if he talks about specifically that part, but he probably does touch on it, because he talks for like an hour about how all the numbers work.
Okay, I think that would be an interesting talk. I'm gonna go watch it. So
yeah, I want to understand that better too.
yeah, because like, the other two things are very intuitive, right? I mean, like, it's like when you just look at it, it's, yes, like for example, if you look at the LCP, right, it's intuitive. Like, the page has to load the biggest element on the page within 2.5 seconds. So, and that's you can, like, kind of understand it by just looking at it. But this is something that I think probably, like, we may have to do some more digging in to figure out like what exactly that's about.
Yeah, I mean, I think your goal should be to have nothing shift in the viewport. I mean, I think when the page loads, everything that's in the initial viewport should be as static as possible. So that doesn't apply to things below the viewport, lazy loaded images, for example, or ads that are below the viewport, or maybe a discussion forum that's way down at the bottom of the page. Those things don't matter. You can expand those before the user reaches them, and there will be no content shift. So I think, like, what you're shooting for is 0. I'm hoping this is the right end of the good scale. I'm not looking at it right now, but where there's no content shift, where as the page loads, things pop in, but there's no shifting. And so basically the browser needs to know the dimension of everything that's going to be in the viewport before the page loads.
Okay, and I'm assuming that this doesn't apply, like, for example, especially on a smaller screen, like when like the orientation of the screen is shifted, like maybe it's shifted from portrait to other things. Like, obviously there's going to be rearrangement of elements, right? I'm assuming like that doesn't count into this.
Right, that doesn't apply unless people are doing that in the real world, I guess, because it is real world metrics. So that's a great question. I don't know how that's captured. But no, this is like typically like a really good example. This would be like a banner ad at the top that loads in, and you didn't remember to add like a CSS height to that box. So the browser, it starts collapse, and then when the ad loads, it expands. So that's like the very typical example. It pushes all the content down. It's a horrible experience for users. We all know that intuitively. But this is a way to actually measure it by watching how things shift around, and by the description is cumulative layout shift. So it's how much does that accumulate over time. So it can include people scrolling down and then things popping in as well. In other words, it's measured for an entire user session. So that's that number. I don't know offhand how it gets between 0 and 1, but you want to keep it as close to no shift as possible.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the related question to that is like, this doesn't apply to elements that are going to be on top of the screen, something like a pop-up or the infamous cookie screen, right? And especially when you're on a smaller, GDPR and other things, right? Especially when you're on a very small screen, it's almost going to take like 25-30% of your viewport. But it, technically you could say that it's not shifting the DOM, but it's like it's like an overlay on top of your content.
Yes, I don't think overlays are included in CLS, so you're safe there in terms of it not messing up your CLS. That said, I don't think it's a great user experience to cover the whole screen with a notice. So there may be something in the future that addresses that tries to limit how much of the screen you can cover or how that is shown. But if the thing that pops in doesn't push the content, if it just overlays the content, it should not affect your CLS.
Okay.
I've heard that question specifically asked before.
Okay. So another related question on the metrics is like for the FID metrics, right? The first input delay. So the time is like from after the page is loaded, right? So I think like it should be less than 100 milliseconds. So that is like after the page is loaded when the user is trying to interact. It doesn't include the page load time. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't like I have to look and see what the number is. Let me bring it up again really quickly here, because I actually don't remember what is the range of those numbers. I'm going back to the slide that I've got the main numbers on. So for first input delay, 100 milliseconds. So I think what that is saying, Sudhar, is that's the amount of time what you want between the first time the user interacts with the site and when the site responds. And when
Okay,
the
okay.
user first interacts with the site is, again, this is a real world user metric, right? So this is actually real world users who come to your site. The page may not have loaded. The page may still be loading, and they're trying to scroll down because they want to get past that ad that they know is loading in that big blank space. So they're trying to load, or they're trying to do something on the page. It could be even before the thing is completely loaded. But it's the time between whenever they start interacting and when the browser actually responds to that input.
Okay. So it's like the time difference between the user doing an action and the the site responding to that action. Okay.
Exactly.
That I
Yeah,
think.
and that's one of the reasons why you can't measure that with a lab measurement, because it's not a lab measurement, it's a user measurement. So I think that there's an alternate measurement that's used. I'm trying to remember what it is. For the lab, it uses TBT, which is, I'm forgetting what that stands for, total blocking time. Is what's used for, that's instead of first input delay, and that's like how long is the main thread blocked for until it becomes available. So it's a different type of metric. It tries to get at the same thing, but again, this one is like very specific to, okay, the user has started interacting, when does the browser respond?
Okay, awesome. So we have another question. So Raja is asking basically, right? There are these recommendations for fixing the issues that page speed and other tools are going to be talking about, right? So are there any additional resources that that people can use to understand like how to fix that? Because like whenever you're doing these tests, there are going to be some recommendations, uh, like reduce the number of assets or something like that, right? But are there any like without, I mean, like, are there any documentation for the best practices, or like the most reliable solutions that people can use to get best results? It's like mostly like, is there a like documented best practices that people can use before, like, obviously right now, like, they can test the page and there could be recommendations on what to fix, but that is only going to show up when there is something wrong. But if they have to proactively make their site better, like, is like the best are all these things documented somewhere, like the best practices and other things?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. First of all, that web.dev site, there's articles specifically about each metric. I think there is definitely some talk in there about how to optimize those things. I think, I think in the WordPress ecosystem, it's a little bit of a different story. We have our own kind of issues to deal with. We have people who install many plugins on their sites. We have other challenges that affect performance that don't have to do with how we built the site in the first place. I do think it's an ongoing thing. I mean, I think when you build the site, it's important to pay attention to, but I think you need to monitor it over time. That's why, like, these dashboards and stuff that you can build are great, because you can go and see how your site has performed over time. You may make no changes as a developer to the site, but have your content owners suddenly start putting in giant iframes or dropping huge images in because they're editing like the source code or doing something bad. You have no control over that, but if you're monitoring sites that you've built, you can see that they've messed up and go back and tell them, hey, you need to fix this. But I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think it's multifaceted, and it's a trade-offs. So I think how you optimize CSS is a whole art into itself. And same thing with HTML, with JavaScript. You really have to think about things like code splitting if you're building something large in JavaScript. So every technology kind of has its own set of best practices. With CSS, it might be like critical CSS and only loading that at first. So yeah, I don't think you can actually be an expert in all these things. I think you have to help. You have to read other people's experience. I do a lot of reading of blog posts. And just keep at it, keep trying to improve. I don't think there is one place to go or one silver bullet. I spend as much time Googling things and reading Stack Exchange articles as anyone else. So
Okay, good. So the next question from Vijayan is about like now assuming that some there are these websites where they would actually be doing different rendering based on some parameters like possibly the users connection speed or maybe the screen size or something like that, right? So
Yeah.
essentially two different users are actually not going to be getting the same experience on the site. Uh, so in those cases, like how do these metrics affect things?
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly why you need real world user metrics. And so what the real world user metrics is, it will average those things out, right? It'll give you a general overview of, on average, how people are experiencing the site. So if you have those real user metrics already available in the Crux database, that's going to be great because it's going to give you actual real user experience. And that's true of like any site. You're going to get different experiences if you're on a mobile device, if you're on a desktop device, if you have a fast internet connection, if you're on a slow mobile connection. Geographically, it can differ where the data center is. There's a lot of variables that go into how a site's going to perform for you as a user at any given time. Also, the server could be under a lot of load. Maybe everyone's using the site during certain times a day, but you test it at other times a day. So without those real user tests, it's very difficult to be sure that what you're testing is accurate. You can see differences as you make changes, but you may not really see how that site is viewed in the wild. So I would say the biggest thing is if you have a site that's very popular, you're going to have that in the Crux database, so you'll be able to get that. If you don't, consider installing this JavaScript that I mentioned. It's a tiny little bit of JavaScript, very low overhead, and it's going to basically report those real user metrics out to your analytics provider and let you capture that data so that you can actually see it. And then like once you have that data in analytics or any other provider, there's a lot of slicing and dicing that you can do for it to see like users in different categories, different geographies, how do they perform. So that can be really interesting.
Okay, awesome. Srikanth had a non-core vital question. So Srikanth, I think we are over time, but if you can quickly ask that question, I think that will be good.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. There is I run a membership site and I'm trying to monetize content, right? And there is always a conflict between what you keep behind the paywall, what you keep in front of the paywall for SEO and all that stuff. I'm sure as a CMS guru for all these years, you've run into such issues. Is there any thought in Google or in general for search engine optimization, how to handle content behind paywall versus in front of paywall, how that balance is work. So you can give a very quick answer. I mean, sorry.
Yeah. So I don't think anyone's figured it out. I don't think there is a solution that the publishing industry has settled on. Is like this is the best way to do a paywall. And I think also it varies depending on who you are. The New York Times is very popular. They may be able to do a metered paywall where you can read 5 articles and then you have to pay. As a smaller publication in a small market, that may not work well for you. The Guardian has been super successful. They're one of the highlights of a really successful publication, and they don't actually do subscriptions. They ask you for a donation.
Yeah,
and they increasingly ask you for the donation more and more the more you visit their site, and their thing gets bigger and more alarming as you have read more articles, but there's no paywall. You can still read the content. At Google, we have a project called Subscribe with Google. The original implementation of that was really for big publishers because it integrated with their offline publishing and their existing publishing systems. Right now, they're working on a newer version of Subscribe with Google that will be much simpler to implement, because part of it is also how do you implement this? How do you make it easy for people to pay? Especially if you're not asking them for, if you're asking them for $1, you want to get them to give you a little bit of money, but it's hard to pay $1 on the internet right now. No one's solved this micropayment problem, and maybe in other places they have, but here in the US, it's still a really big problem. We have been working on the NewsPack site with some micropayment vendors who really want to be in the WordPress ecosystem. Ultimately, it'd be great if we all had a wallet that we could drop 2 cents or 5 cents or 50 cents into a newspaper for reading one article, rather than having to subscribe for a year. So I think it's super challenging. There are, with things like Subscribe with Google, there's some really cool integrations you can get. For example, one of the real problems people have is with the paywall is okay, I subscribe to the New York Times, but now I'm using Flipboard or Apple News or Google News or some other news reader. I'm not even going to the New York Times anymore. I'm just in a content ingester. do they know that I have a subscription to this restricted content? You know, like, do those systems integrate? That's a really big question that also hasn't been solved. You know, Google News may, but maybe this other service doesn't know about it. So long story short, there is no, like, I don't have an answer for you. I think it's something you need to study with your users, with your specific users, do A/B testing, you know, get Google Optimize set up and deliver 2 different experiences to your users. Another really important thing is the first-time visitor is not the same as the second-time visitor in terms of how they're going to respond to that. So first-time visitors, maybe there's no paywall, but second-time visitor, hey, we see you know, coming back. So it's not necessarily metered, but again, sort of like The Guardian does, where you get a increasingly more, hey, we see you like our content, like, glad to have you back, and would you like to pay for this now, because this is how we make our living. You know, so I think having that in place, so that involves, that's quite sophisticated, right? You have to track your users using analytics or some other platforms. There's a lot of platforms that aim to try to solve this problem. This is something we're seeing in the Newspack project. A lot of people come in and they use these third-party platforms like Piano, Pico, Harken. There's platforms where it'll put a form or block content on your site, but it also integrates into a backend that ties into analytics and will deliver different user experiences to different users. So these are really cool systems. They tend to be pretty pricey. They're not, you know, but it is also something that can give you ideas of things that you could implement on your own, which is something like if you follow the Newspack project, it's super interesting. I would recommend following that project on GitHub. You can see right now they're actually developing exactly what I'm talking about, which is tracking users with analytics, which you can track users with analytics in an anonymized kind of way, and then delivering different content to those users based on whether they're returning or not. Whoops, I got locked out. My computer locked.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for the very detailed answer. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thanks everyone. I really enjoyed giving the presentation. Thanks for taking the time out to listen to it, and thanks Sudhar for inviting me. It was really good practice for me to get to give this presentation in this format.
And thank you, Adam, for taking time and giving this presentation for us, and also for getting up very early on a Saturday for us. I know it was too early for you and all that. And yeah, as I said, it was very helpful. I'm pretty sure a lot of people had really interesting insights, and personally, I learned a lot of things from this talk. So thanks for taking time doing this.
Great, and I welcome any follow-up questions. I'm on Core Slack. I'm also on Twitter at Round Earth, and my DMs are open. So feel free if you forgot to ask me something or didn't want to ask about it here, ask me about it whenever.
Thanks, Adam.